All right. This is from John. Now, look, don't want to get you offside, Will, but he has some issue with you in regards to your belief that everyone should have listened to Radiohead or should know who Radiohead is. So just be prepared. There's some strong statements here. Feel free
so long ago, like to be holding on to this.
I know. He opens with a compliment. Hey, gents, thanks for the lovely comedy conversations. To cover off a couple of things, I'm a doctor, so we have to read it.
Okay.
As a medical professional.
Nice to have you here. I appreciate it.
I listened to TOEFOP all the way through my first 2 degrees while studying for the GAMSAT, Aussie Grad Medical School exam, and then through med school. So not only do doctors listen to us, Will,
we make doctors.
While they save lives.
Exactly.
We make doctors. Is it time to update the
TOEFOP?
On this
we
show?
make doctors.
Doctors. Have you seen a doctor recently? You can thank us.
Yeah, we're doc makers. Oh, documentaries. No, doctors. We literally make doctors.
Yeah. Surgeons, GPs, gynecologists, you name it.
Yeah.
My wife, also a doctor, has listened only because I made her.
That's all right.
But count her anyway.
Yep.
You can pad the stats. I can confirm I used a fax machine this week. The old school one, not even the nice digital one some hospitals have. And I have been here from the start. I found you guys in 2010 in the first year of the podcast after a recommendation on a forum. Wow. What kind of forum in 2010 would TOEFOP have appeared in?
Penthouse forum.
Penthouse.
You'll never believe what happened.
The stories were true. But I was listening to a podcast. The only person I've ever talked to about TOEFOP who was already a fan was another doctor. Fucking hell, mate. We're just making doctors left, right, and center.
We're a doctor factory.
The doctor factory. I talked to him in my first week of working in a hospital. He suggested I stop bringing it up at work because it's an open secret. We all listen, but no one wants to accept responsibility for liking the early episodes before any of us knew better.
Yeah.
Now I'm feeling like that's a joke, but I do want to believe that it's an open secret amongst Australia's medical professionals that they all listen to TOEFOP. Like, wouldn't that just imagine if our podcast had done something so worthwhile. We had given back without even knowing it.
I think also there is an element when it comes to doctors that they see the worst that, like, much like, like murder police. I think that's the official name for them.
Yeah, pretty sure. Like, call the police. Why? Has it been a robbery? No, worse, a murder. Call the murder police.
So when the murder police, from what I've watched on TV, mostly Law and Order, when the murder police turn up, they cope with the murders that they see as murder police with like quite a dark sense of humor. And I imagine the doctors would probably have the same. So what might be shocking to the sensibilities of, like, if you've got to see people at their worst, you've got to deal with like blood and feces and all these sort of things, that the idea of dealing with the early episodes of our podcast might not be as shocking to them as it would be to other more sensitive people.
Yeah, Blood and Feces, also the name of my high school band.
Yeah, loved them.
Down to the point of my email.
Yeah.
I was just listening to episode 311, about 3 years late. COVID sucked for me, and I stopped listening to podcasts entirely for a couple of years, and I'm catching up. Maybe when you read this in 6 months, we'll be up to date. Anyway, you certainly have listened to everything, John. Anyway, Will is getting upset about Ben Elton having never listened to OK Computer. 311 seems late. I feel like that was a much earlier discussion, but maybe we brought it up again in 311. Yes, he acknowledged that lots of people hadn't listened to the album, and it's specifically a social commentator having not listened to the album that surprised him. But Will said words to the effect of, and I quote, he would have heard bits of it, if not all of it, on the radio or movies, in ads or in shops. I was dubious. This is a Dr. Dubious. We're going to call John from now on.
Yeah.
Dr. Dubious. Now, I'm not of the same vintage. I'm a millennial, an actual one, not a 25-year-old. They're Zoomers. Bloody hell, he's schooling us left, right, and center, old Dr. Dubious.
I like this precision, though, in a doctor. I feel like this is what I want from a doctor. Like, he's certainly taking me apart with surgical precision, so let's strap ourselves in.
So I was in school when this album came out. I don't think I'm too young to have heard it. So I went and listened to the whole thing. I have never heard it. Never heard any of these songs in their entirety. I can tell it was a big deal because I know I've heard similar music that was either inspired by the album or drew from the same inspirations. It kind of feels familiar, but also way off and alien. I vaguely recognize the piano from No Surprises.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've heard a karaoke version or no lyrics version of it in a film, or it was sampled in something. But none of the vocals sound in any way familiar in any of the songs. To be frank, I can't even agree that none of it is unlistenable. It's just not, but that's just my taste. My point being, I'm only about a decade younger, maybe less than you guys at this point, and it just wasn't part of my social consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that maybe it felt bigger to Will than it actually was. I can't honestly point to any album from my lifetime that I would have expected people to have listened to. Fair enough, iTunes and buying singles plays into that, but if I had to pick an album everyone has heard, I'd have to go as far back as the Beatles or something. That is an interesting point.
So, yeah, but that's a young person's thing to think, because that is just generational. It's from a time when this was still, and I think this is why it is one of the most like iconic albums of all time, is it changed music. It was the kind of height of that, British music scene. And it was where it evolved from being that, Blur and Oasis-y thing to being something completely different to that. And like, it was the sort of album that meant there was, bands like Coldplay. There hadn't been like a group like that. That album was iconic in a time where albums were iconic. I am absolutely happy to agree that albums are not as iconic today. That makes a lot of sense to me. But Ben Elton isn't 10 years younger than me. Ben Elton is 10 years older than me. He's from a time where albums were even more important.
But do you think that's why it skipped past him? Like,
but this is the same as me not knowing, like, I know who Blackpink is. I've watched a documentary about Blackpink. I like have an idea of what K-pop is. I can tell you who The Weeknd is, or like, like when the new
Bad Bunny, is that a rapper or a wrestler? I can't work it out.
Yep,
because I've seen
that. I can't tell you. There you go. There's my blind spot. Bad Bunny. If there's some young comedian on a podcast complaining about the fact that I don't know who Bad Bunny is, I'm willing to wear that. But when the new Taylor Swift album comes out, I ever listen to the Taylor Swift album to see what the fuss is about. When so and so plays the Super Bowl halftime, I do that because as a cultural commentator, like, you do have, if something is that big a cultural moment, I do think that I still stand by I think it's weird that he thinks, and by the way, I think that it's okay maybe that a young person hasn't heard that album, but at the time, if you were an older person, that album was everywhere. Like, it was.
I wonder if I'd like to ask Dr. Dubious John if he's like Nevermind. Like, I'd say that of that era, say that decade, that kind of 90s decade, like Nevermind is the album, because it basically launched an entire music movement. Or, maybe it's The Chronic or something like that if you're into more hip hop. But I imagine that he would have heard of Nevermind. And if you are British, like Radiohead were as influential or as big as Nirvana were.
It is. Like, I mean, OK Computer is like in a category with Nevermind as being a generational album because of the
game changer.
Yeah, the effect that it had on the broader industry. The way that you can see, even in, like, Dr. Dubious admits in this email that he, even though he doesn't recognize the vocal or the music, he recognizes things that have clearly been inspired by that. That's the cultural imprint that we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. He continues, I think that it was a huge deal for people in their formative years who are witnessing the birth of home computer and the GUI, graphic user interface like Windows 95 and the internet, but maybe it wasn't a revelation to people of Ben Elton's vintage. It's like how The Matrix was insanely important to everyone I knew in high school, but people who were 30 when it came out just recall bullet time and probably only saw it once.
Yeah, but that's like people saying, but that's the other thing is like, that's the equivalent of somebody saying, like a movie like Hook or a movie like, sometimes like you look at Minions or whatever. You look at a Next Generation
Space Jam.
Yeah.
Space People.
But I watched all those movies because I'm a cultural commentator. And if an entire generation of people is into something, I watched it. I'm not saying that Ben Elton had to dig it, but I'm aware that, there was a whole bunch of young people who liked Minions and like were dressing up and going to Minions. This is the point I was making.
I reckon if Ben Elton was the same age as Will, it would be way more weird that he hadn't heard the album. I'm curious if that changes Will's perspective at all. No, I think we've pretty much examined that. Anyway, cheers, gents. You've been a massive positive influence on me over the last decade plus, and Will has shared some reassuring words over over Facebook years ago when I was in a dark place and sent a message. So thanks for always being there to make me laugh and drag me through shitty times to the good ones. You're welcome, John. As Will stated earlier, TOEFOP, we make doctors.
We make them, and I've just clicked on a link here. So this is Pitchfork's best albums, best records between 1996 and 2021. So I'm just going to quickly see if I can find where on this list. Okay, so where do you think of Pitchfork, a big music magazine? Where did OK Computer by Radiohead come on? You know what? I'll give you some other albums that are in the top 10 just to give you a bit of a sense of what it might be. So number 10 was Wilco's Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. For that style of music, that was kind of the OK Computer of alt country. Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City. Yep, iconic album by iconic artists. The Strokes, Is This It? Again, that's a pretty big gaming changing album. Arcade Fire Funeral at number 7. Yep, I get that. Frank Ocean's Blonde at number 6. Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, which was his Pulitzer Prize winning album, came in at number 5.
Is that true?
Yep. Number 4.
So out of touch.
Number 4 was Radiohead with an album they made called In Rainbows. Number 3, Kanye West with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. And at number 2 on Pitchfork's top 200 albums of the last 25 years is OK Computer by Radiohead. So,
what's number 1?
Radiohead. Another Radiohead album. They like Radiohead.
Oh, really? I was going to say, I don't know if this is the most objective poll.
It's Pitchfork. It's like that's as big a music magazine as you get in the entire.
To see the full video, join our Patreon.
Patreon.com/TOEFOP.